The drums stopped the moment Damian Cross opened his mouth. Every wolf in the circle turned toward him, waiting for the words that would bind him to his fated mate forever. Instead, he looked straight at Elena Voss and said the one sentence no alpha was supposed to say in front of his pack. I reject this bond. I reject you. The clearing went cold. Torches cracked in the silence. Hundreds of pack members stood frozen around the stone circle, waiting for Elena to break down the way rejected mates always did. Waiting for the screaming, the tears, the collapse that everyone had seen before at other ceremonies. None of it came. Elena stood perfectly still, her chin lifted a fraction of an inch. Her eyes, usually soft and warm, turned steady and unreadable. She looked at Damian for 3 long seconds, and then she said only 4 words. I accept your decision. Then she turned and walked out of the circle, her steps calm, her back straight, as if she had simply been told the weather would change. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. An alpha king had just humiliated his own fated mate in front of the entire Blackthorn pack, and instead of falling apart, she had walked away like a queen leaving a room that no longer interested her. That silence, the one that followed her through the crowd, was heavier than any scream could have been. Marcus, the pack beta and Damian's oldest friend, watched her go with his jaw tight. He had known Elena since she was a child running through the training yard with her father, the pack's late healer. He had never once seen her look at anyone the way she had just looked at Damian, not with hurt, but with something closer to finality. He glanced at his alpha and saw the same confusion on Damian's face that everyone else felt. Rejection was supposed to break the Omega. It was supposed to leave her crying at his feet, begging him to reconsider. Instead, she had simply agreed with him and left. Damian told himself he had done the right thing. 6 months earlier, his father had died defending the northern border from a pack of rogues, and Damian had taken the mantle of Alpha King far sooner than he was ready for. He had sworn to himself, standing over his father's grave, that he would never let anything make him weak again. Emotion had cost his father his life. Love had made him hesitate at the worst possible moment. Damian would not repeat that mistake. A mate bond meant vulnerability, and an Alpha King who ruled 6 territories could not afford to be vulnerable. He believed, in that clearing, that rejecting Elena was an act of strength. He did not expect it to feel like something had been ripped out of his chest the instant the words left his mouth. He pushed the feeling down and addressed the pack as though nothing unusual had happened, announcing that the border patrols would double after last week's rogue sightings near Thorn Ridge. His voice was steady, his shoulders were squared, but under his skin, something had shifted, a hollow ache settling low in his ribs, where his wolf usually sat calm and certain. He ignored it. He told himself it would pass. Elena did not go back to her cabin near the healer's den. She walked instead to the edge of the training field, past the old oak tree where her father used to teach her about herbs and wound care, and she sat down on the fallen log they used to share. Only then, alone, with no pack eyes on her, did her calm finally crack. Her hands trembled, her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her chest, but she did not cry, not really. She had promised herself, the moment Damian's rejection left his lips, that she would not give him her tears in front of anyone, not even the moon. Her best friend, Priya, found her there an hour later. Priya was the pack's newest healer trainee, sharp-tongued and fiercely loyal, and she had watched the ceremony from the back of the crowd, with her hands balled into fists. She sat down beside Elena without a word and simply waited. It was Elena who finally spoke. She told Priya that she had felt the bond the instant Damian walked into the circle, a pull so strong it had nearly buckled her knees, a warmth that told her this man, this cold and guarded stranger, was supposed to be hers. She told Priya that she had seen something flicker in his eyes before he rejected her, something that looked almost like fear rather than disgust. And then she said the thing that would define everything that came after. She said she would not spend her life waiting for a man who was too afraid of his own heart to claim her. If Damian Cross did not want her, then she would build a life he was not part of, and she would build it so well that his rejection would never be able to touch her again. Priya asked her if she meant that, or if she was only saying it to survive the night. Elena did not answer right away. She looked out at the dark tree line, at the mountains beyond it where the moon was rising full and silver, and she said that surviving the night and meaning it did not have to be different things. Sometimes a person had to choose the second one on purpose, or the first one would break them completely. News of the rejection spread through the pack within a day. the way news always did in a place where everyone lived close enough to hear each other's business. Some wolves pitied Elena. Others whispered that she must have done something wrong to be denied by an alpha king, because surely no man would reject his fated mate without reason. Elena heard the whispers. She said nothing in response, offered no explanations, gave no one the satisfaction of watching her defend herself. She simply kept walking through the pack grounds each morning, with her chin level and her eyes forward, and slowly, the whispers began to change shape. It was hard to pity someone who refused to act pitiful. 3 days after the ceremony, Elena stopped attending the communal meals in the Great Hall. She began taking her food to the healer's den instead, eating alone or with Priya, while she reorganized the medicine stores that had gone untouched since her father's death 2 winters before. She had trained under him since she could walk, learning the names of every root and leaf that grew within a day's run of packland, but she had never taken up his position formally. She had been too young when he died, and too unsure of herself to claim a role that important. Now, with nothing left to lose in front of a pack that had already watched her lowest moment, she found she no longer cared about looking unsure. She spent that first week rebuilding the den from the ground up. She relabeled every jar. She threw out herbs that had gone stale, and replaced them with fresh stock she gathered herself, walking the forest paths alone before dawn, when no one else was awake to watch her. She did not need anyone's permission to be useful. She only needed her hands to stay busy and her mind to stay occupied, because the moment either one went still, she could feel the bond aching somewhere under her sternum, a phantom thread connecting her to a man who did not want to hold the other end of it. Damien, meanwhile, was discovering that rejection was not the clean, painless solution he had expected it to be. It started small. A dull tiredness that sleep did not fix, a tightness behind his ribs that flared whenever he caught sight of Elena from a distance, whether she was crossing the training yard or standing at the edge of the healer's den with her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back. He told himself it was stress, the natural weight of a young alpha king managing 6 territories with rogue wolves testing his borders every week. He doubled his training sessions to work off the restlessness. He took on more border patrols himself, instead of delegating them, needing the physical exhaustion to drown out whatever was happening inside him. Marcus noticed before anyone else did. He had spent years learning to read Damien's moods, the small signals that gave away what his friend would never say aloud, and he saw the shift immediately. Damien's temper, always controlled, had grown short. His focus during pack council meetings kept slipping, his eyes drifting toward the window that faced the healer's den even when no one there could be seen from that angle. Marcus recognized the signs from stories his own grandfather used to tell, old stories about rejection sickness, a condition that struck alphas who severed a true bond and then found their body refusing to accept the separation. It was rare. It was dangerous. And it was, according to every story Marcus had ever heard, something that grew worse with time, rather than better. He brought it up to Damien carefully one evening after a council meeting, staying behind while the others filed out of the hall. He asked his alpha, plainly, if he had considered that rejecting Elena might cost him more than his pride. Damien's answer was short and final. He said the bond was severed. He said there was nothing left to consider. Marcus did not push further that night, but he left the hall with a knot of worry in his stomach that would not loosen for weeks. What none of them knew yet, not Damien, not Marcus, not even Elena herself, was that the quiet transformation happening in the healer's den was about to become something the entire pack could not ignore. Elena's reorganized stores did not stay a private project for long. Within 2 weeks, pack members who had never once visited the healer's den for anything beyond a basic salve began showing up with more serious complaints, injuries from patrol, fevers that had lingered too long, aches that the previous system of scattered remedies had never quite solved. Word passed quietly among the wolves that the healer's daughter had a steady hand and an even steadier mind, that she listened carefully before she treated anyone, that she never once flinched or looked away, no matter how difficult the injury in front of her was. She earned a kind of respect that had nothing to do with being an alpha's rejected mate, and everything to do with who she actually was, underneath that title. One evening, a young warrior named Owen came stumbling into the den with a deep gash along his forearm, torn open during a border skirmish with a rogue that had slipped past the outer patrol. He was pale from blood loss and shaking, more from fear than pain. young enough that this was his first real wound taken in defense of the pack. Elena worked on him without a single wasted motion, cleaning the wound, stitching it closed with careful, even hands, talking to him softly the entire time about anything except the injury itself, asking him about his family, about the mountains where he grew up, anything to keep his mind from the fear. By the time she finished, Owen had stopped shaking entirely. He told her, quietly, that she had a gift, and that the pack was lucky to have her, whether the Alpha King saw it or not. That last part slipped out before he could stop himself, and he immediately looked embarrassed, worried he had overstepped. But Elena only offered him a small, genuine smile, the first real one anyone had seen from her since the rejection ceremony. She told him that the Alpha King's opinion of her had stopped mattering to her work a long time ago, and that she intended to keep it that way. Word of that exchange spread too, the way everything spread in a pack this size. And somewhere in the retelling, it stopped being a story about a rejected Omega quietly falling apart, and it started becoming something else entirely, a story about a woman who had been publicly humiliated by the most powerful man in 6 territories, and had responded not with despair, but with quiet, undeniable competence. The pack, without fully realizing it was happening, began to watch Elena Voss with a very different kind of attention. Damien heard the stories too. He heard them from Marcus, who mentioned them with a pointed, careful tone that made it clear he wanted his alpha to understand exactly what he was hearing. He heard them from pack elders who praised the healer's daughter during council meetings, unaware or unconcerned that their alpha's jaw tightened every time her name was spoken. He heard them, most painfully, from his own wolf, the primal instinct buried deep in his chest that had gone quiet and sullen since the night of the rejection, stirring now, every time Elena's name reached his ears, as if some part of him understood exactly what he had thrown away and refused to let him forget it. He told himself, again and again, that he did not care. He told himself that an Alpha King did not need to care what a rejected mate did with her days, that his responsibility was to the safety of 6 territories and nothing more, that the ache under his ribs was exhaustion and nothing else. But late at night, alone in his quarters, staring up at a ceiling he could not sleep beneath, he found himself replaying the sound of her voice in the clearing. "I accept your decision." 4 words that should have given him the closure he wanted. Instead, they echoed in his skull, like the opening line of a story that was far from finished. 2 weeks after the rejection, a delegation arrived at the border requesting an audience with the Alpha King. Rogue attacks had increased along the eastern edge of Blackthorn territory, and reports were beginning to suggest something more organized than simple wandering wolves. Coordinated movements, deliberate testing of the pack's defenses. Damien called an emergency council meeting, and for the first time in his short reign, he felt genuinely uncertain about how to respond. His father would have known instantly. His father would not have been distracted by an ache in his chest that refused to fade. In that meeting, Marcus suggested, carefully, that the healer's den should be placed on alert given the possibility of increased casualties, and that its current head, unofficial as her title still was, should be looped into border strategy discussions, so that medical response could move as quickly as military response. Damien agreed, because the suggestion made tactical sense, and because refusing it for personal reasons would have exposed exactly the weakness he was trying so hard to hide. He told himself it was purely a matter of pack safety. He did not expect that agreeing to it would mean sitting across a war table from Elena Voss within the week, watching her speak with calm authority about wound triage and evacuation routes, watching every wolf in that room listen to her with genuine respect, watching her look at him with nothing but flat, professional composure, as if the man who had rejected her in front of the entire pack was simply another alpha she needed to coordinate with, and nothing more. It was, Damien realized as the meeting ended, and she gathered her notes without a single glance in his direction, the first time in 2 weeks he had been close enough to actually feel the pull of the bond, instead of just its absence. And it was far worse than the distance had been. He watched her walk out of the war room, spine straight, steps unhurried, and for the first time since the rejection ceremony, doubt crept into his chest alongside the ache, doubt about the decision he had made in that clearing, doubt about whether strength and vulnerability were as opposite as he had believed, doubt that grew heavier with every step Elena took away from him, unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, of exactly what she was leaving behind. The pack that had gone silent the night of the rejection was no longer silent now. It was watching, waiting, wondering which version of this story would win. The Alpha King who had chosen isolation over vulnerability, or the woman who had turned his rejection into the foundation of her own quiet, unstoppable rise. Neither Damien nor Elena yet understood how much further this story still had to go, or how completely the ground beneath both of them was about to shift. A scream tore through the training yard just after dawn, sharp enough to bring every wolf within earshot running. Elena was already moving before she even registered deciding to move, her medicine bag slung over one shoulder, her feet carrying her across the frost-covered grass toward the sound. A young warrior named Callum lay on the ground near the sparring ring, his leg bent at an angle that made several onlookers turn pale, the result of a training accident that had gone wrong in an instant. Elena dropped to her knees beside him, without a moment of hesitation, her hands already assessing the break before her mind had finished catching up. She worked quickly, calling out instructions to the wolves gathered around her, sending one to fetch splints, another to bring hot water, a third to hold Callum still while she set the bone. Her voice never wavered, even as Callum groaned in pain beneath her hands. By the time Priya arrived to help, Elena had already stabilized the injury enough that the danger of permanent damage had passed. It was, everyone who witnessed it agreed afterward, one of the calmest displays of skill the pack had seen in years. Damien arrived moments after it was over, drawn by the commotion, and found the crowd already dispersing, murmuring praise for the healer's quick hands. He watched Elena help Callum to his feet, watched the young warrior thank her with genuine gratitude, watched the easy respect that passed between them, and felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest. It was not jealousy, he told himself. It could not be jealousy. He had rejected her. He had no right to feel anything when another wolf looked at her with warmth. But the twist in his chest did not care what he told himself, and it did not fade for the rest of the day. That night, the ache that had been building in him for weeks finally became something he could no longer ignore. He collapsed in the middle of his own quarters, his knees buckling without warning, his vision swimming as pain radiated through his chest and down both arms. Marcus found him there an hour later, having grown worried when Damien failed to appear for the evening patrol briefing, and the sight that greeted him sent ice through his veins. His alpha, the strongest wolf in 6 territories, was on the floor of his own room, sweat soaking through his shirt, his breathing shallow and uneven. Marcus did not call for the healer's den immediately. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, exactly what he was looking at. He had heard the old stories his grandfather used to tell around the fire, stories about alphas who rejected their fated mates and paid for it with their own bodies, their strength unraveling thread by thread as the bond they had severed refused to release its hold on them. He had hoped, foolishly, that those stories were exaggerated, that Damien's exhaustion was simple stress and nothing more. Kneeling on the floor beside his collapsed friend, he understood that hope had been misplaced. He helped Damien back into bed and sat with him through the worst of it, watching the color slowly return to his alpha's face as the episode passed. When Damien could finally speak again, his voice was rough and quiet, stripped of its usual command. He asked Marcus what was happening to him. Marcus told him the truth, gently but without softening it, because he knew Damien would see through any attempt to spare him. He told him about rejection sickness, about the price an alpha paid for severing a true bond, about how the condition only grew worse the longer the separation lasted. He told him, finally, that there was only one known cure, and it was not one Damien wanted to hear. Damien closed his eyes and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was not to argue or deny it. It was to ask, quietly, if there was any other way. Marcus shook his head. The old stories were clear on that point, even if they were vague on almost everything else. The bond had to be restored, willingly, by both wolves, or the sickness would continue to spread until it consumed the alpha entirely. Damien did not sleep that night. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning the truth over in his mind, like a stone he could not put down. He had rejected Elena to protect himself from vulnerability, to prove to himself and to his pack that he could rule without needing anyone. Instead, his own body had turned against him, proving with brutal clarity that the bond he had tried to erase was not something he could simply decide away. He thought of Elena's calm hands setting Callum's broken leg that morning, of the respect in every voice that spoke her name now, of the way she had looked at him across the war room, with nothing but flat professionalism, as though he had never mattered to her at all. He wondered, with a bitterness he had no right to feel, whether she would care at all if she knew what rejecting her was doing to him. He decided, in the gray hour before dawn, that she would not find out from him, not yet. He told himself it was because an alpha king did not go begging for sympathy from the woman he had wronged, that pride demanded he handle this on his own. The truth, though he would not admit it even to himself, was closer to fear. He was afraid that if he told her, and she looked at him with the same cold indifference she had shown in the war room, something inside him would break in a way that no amount of strength could repair. He hid the episode from the rest of the pack, swearing Marcus to silence, and threw himself back into his duties the following day, as though nothing had happened. He led the morning patrol himself, pushing his body harder than usual, needing the burn in his muscles to distract from the hollow ache still lingering beneath his ribs. He told himself the sickness would pass on its own, that his wolf simply needed time to adjust to the separation, that Marcus and the old stories were being overly dramatic about a condition that surely was not as severe as they claimed. The second episode came 4 days later, in the middle of a council meeting, in front of every pack elder and warrior seated at the table. It began quietly, a slight unsteadiness in Damien's voice as he addressed the growing rogue activity along the eastern border. Marcus, seated beside him, noticed the tremor in his alpha's hand first, the way it gripped the edge of the table just a fraction too hard. Then Damien's words began to slur, his sentence trailing off mid-thought, and before anyone could react, he slumped forward, catching himself against the table as the room erupted into alarmed shouting. Elena was summoned before anyone thought to question whether she should be the one called, because in a crisis, the healer's den answered regardless of who needed help. She arrived at a run, her medicine bag already open before she reached his side, and found Damien half-conscious, his skin pale, his breathing ragged, surrounded by pack elders who had no idea what was happening to their alpha. For one suspended moment, kneeling beside him, with her hands hovering over his chest, Elena felt the bond flare to life inside her, a warmth and recognition so overwhelming it nearly stole her breath. She pushed the feeling down with practiced discipline, and focused instead on what her training had taught her, checking his pulse, his breathing, the dilation of his eyes, searching for any physical explanation that would make sense of what she was seeing. She found nothing. No fever, no wound, no poison in his blood that she could detect. Whatever was happening to Damien Cross was not something her father's medicine had ever taught her to treat. She looked up and found Marcus watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something between guilt and desperate hope. She asked him directly what he knew that he was not saying. Marcus hesitated only a moment before he told her, quietly, so the others crowding the room would not overhear. He told her about rejection sickness. He told her that Damien had collapsed once before, days earlier, and had sworn him to secrecy. He told her, finally, with a directness that left no room for misunderstanding, that the only way to stop it was for the bond between them to be restored. Elena went very still. She looked down at Damien, whose eyes had fluttered half open, whose gaze found hers with a clarity that suggested he had heard every word Marcus just said. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them stretched long enough that the rest of the room seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of them, and the truth that had just been laid bare in front of an audience neither had chosen. Elena finished stabilizing him without another word, her hands steady, even as her mind raced through everything she had just learned. When Damien was stable enough to be moved, she instructed 2 warriors to carry him to his own quarters, rather than the healer's den, insisting that an alpha collapsing in front of his council was already enough of a shock to the pack, without the added spectacle of him being carried through the grounds to the healer's building. It was a practical decision, but it was also, though she did not say so aloud, a small mercy she chose to extend him even now. Before she left his quarters, Damien caught her wrist, his grip weak but insistent. He asked her, his voice barely above a whisper, not to feel obligated. He told her that whatever was happening to him was his own consequence to face, born from his own choice, and that she owed him nothing, not her forgiveness, not her bond, not even her presence in that room. Elena looked down at his hand around her wrist for a long moment, before gently pulling free. She told him, evenly, that she had not come because she felt obligated. She had come because she was the healer, and healers helped whoever needed help, regardless of what that person had once done to them. She said it without cruelty, but without warmth either. A simple statement of fact that left Damien staring at the ceiling long after she had gone, the ache in his chest now tangled with something far more complicated than physical pain. Word of the collapse spread through the pack by morning, though the true cause remained known only to a handful of people. Officially, it was announced that the Alpha King was suffering from exhaustion after weeks of increased patrol duty, and would be resting under the healer's supervision. Unofficially, whispers began to circulate, quiet questions about why the healer's daughter, the very woman he had rejected, was the one seen leaving his quarters with her medicine bag, and why Marcus looked so grim every time her name came up in conversation. Elena did not confirm or deny any of it. She continued her work exactly as she had before, tending to injuries in the den, walking the forest paths at dawn to gather herbs, refusing to let the rumors change the rhythm of her days. But at night, alone in her small room above the healer's den, she found herself thinking about the look in Damien's eyes as he lay on that council room floor, about the fear buried beneath his pride when he told her not to feel obligated. She thought about the bond that still lived in her chest, stubborn and unbroken despite his rejection, and she wondered, with a mixture of frustration and something she refused to name, how much longer she could keep pretending it did not exist. She had built a life, in the weeks since the ceremony, that did not depend on Damien Cross wanting her. She had earned respect on her own terms, carved out a place for herself that had nothing to do with being anyone's mate. She was not willing to let his sickness undo any of that progress, was not willing to become, once again, a woman defined entirely by her connection to an Alpha King. But she was not cruel enough to simply let him suffer either, not when her healer's oath demanded more of her than her wounded pride wanted to give. Somewhere in that tension, between the life she had built and the bond she could not sever no matter how hard either of them tried, the next chapter of this story was already beginning to take shape, whether Elena was ready for it or not. 3 wolves were found dead near Thorn Ridge, on a morning so cold that frost had sealed their wounds shut before the patrol even reached them. Marcus stood over the bodies with his jaw clenched, counting the bite marks, the claw patterns, the deliberate way the attack had been staged to look random when it clearly was not. This was the 4th incident in 2 weeks, and each one showed the same signs of coordination that no ordinary rogue pack should have possessed. Damien arrived at the scene an hour later, moving slower than he used to, though he masked it well enough that only Marcus noticed the effort behind every step. The sickness had not returned in full force since the council meeting, but it lingered now, as a constant undercurrent, a fatigue that never fully lifted, no matter how much he rested. He crouched beside the fallen wolves, studying the wounds with a grim focus that pushed everything else from his mind, at least for the moment. He called an emergency strategy session that evening, and this time, without needing to be convinced, he requested that Elena be present. He told himself it was purely tactical, that a healer's understanding of wound patterns could help identify what kind of weapon or bite had caused the deaths, that her presence in the war room had nothing to do with wanting to see her again. He almost believed it himself. Elena arrived with a leather satchel of notes she had compiled from treating every border injury over the past month, a habit she had started without anyone asking her to, simply because it seemed useful to track which patterns kept repeating. She laid her notes across the war table and pointed out something the trackers had missed, that every attack had occurred within a narrow window after moonrise, and that the wound patterns suggested the attackers were not simply rogue wolves, but trained fighters, using coordinated bite formations, the kind taught in organized pack militaries, rather than found among scattered rogues. The room went quiet as the implications settled. If she was right, this was not a rogue problem. This was the early movement of an organized pack testing Blackthorn's borders, likely searching for weaknesses before a larger strike. Marcus asked her how she had noticed the pattern when the trackers, trained specifically for this kind of analysis, had missed it. Elena said simply that she had spent weeks stitching the wounds these attacks left behind, and a body told a story that footprints in the dirt sometimes could not. Damien watched her lay out her reasoning with the same calm precision she used to set a broken bone, watched the elders around the table lean in, genuinely listening, genuinely convinced. He felt something that was not quite pride and not quite longing, some third feeling he did not have a name for, settle in his chest as he realized how thoroughly she had made herself indispensable to a pack that had once treated her only as his forgotten mate. He appointed her, that night, as an official advisor to the Border Strategy Council, a role with no precedent for someone who was not born into a warrior or tactical family. Some of the elders murmured about tradition, about whether a healer belonged at a war table. Damien silenced the murmurs with a single sentence, telling them plainly that he would rather listen to the wolf who understood the wounds than the wolf who had never had to look at one closely enough to learn from it. It was, though neither of them said it aloud, the closest thing to an apology he had offered her since the rejection. Elena did not thank him for the appointment. She simply nodded, gathered her notes, and returned to the work in front of her, treating the new responsibility as exactly that, a responsibility, not a gift from a man trying to make amends. If Damien was disappointed by her lack of reaction, he did not let it show, though Marcus caught the flicker of something in his alpha's eyes as she left the room that night, something that looked, for just a moment, like a man watching a door close on a chance he had not fully appreciated until it was already gone. Over the following 2 weeks, Elena threw herself into the investigation with the same intensity she had once poured into rebuilding the healer's den. She cross-referenced every attack, every wound pattern, every timing detail, building a picture that slowly began to point toward a specific stretch of forest along the eastern border, where the coordinated pack seemed to be staging its movements. She worked alongside Owen and a handful of trackers, learning to read the forest the way they did, translating what she found into medical language they could use, and translating their tracking language back into patterns she could analyze for injury type and severity. It was during this work that the pack's perception of her shifted once more, this time in a way that had nothing to do with sympathy or rumor. Wolves who had once only known her as the rejected Omega now began referring to her, without irony, as one of the sharpest minds in the Strategy Council. Young pups in the training yard whispered that she could read a wound like a story, that she had helped catch the scent trail no one else could find. Elena heard these whispers too, and unlike the ones that had followed the rejection ceremony, these did not sting. They settled into her chest like something solid, something she had built entirely with her own hands. Priya, watching her friend transform over those weeks, from a woman quietly grieving a public humiliation, into a woman the entire pack had begun to genuinely respect, asked her one evening whether she ever thought about what would happen if Damien's sickness worsened again, whether the growing distance between her new purpose and her old bond would eventually force a choice she was not ready to make. Elena admitted, honestly, that she thought about it more than she wanted to. She said that every time she felt the bond flare, whether from being near him in the war room or simply hearing his name spoken in council, she had to actively choose not to let it define her, the same way she had chosen not to let his rejection define her in the first place. She told Priya that she was proud of what she had built, that the pack's respect meant more to her than she had expected it to, and that she refused to let anyone, including Damien Cross, take that away from her again, whether through rejection or through desperate reconciliation. If the bond was ever restored, she said, it would happen because both of them chose it as equals, not because his body was punishing him for a mistake, and she happened to be the cure available to fix it. She would not be reduced to a remedy. She had spent too many weeks becoming something more than that. The investigation reached a turning point on a moonless night, when Owen's scouting patrol spotted movement along the eastern ridge. 3 unfamiliar wolves, moving in careful formation, exactly where Elena's analysis had predicted they would appear. The patrol retreated without engaging, reporting back to Damien and the Strategy Council before dawn. The confirmation sent a ripple of both vindication and alarm through the room. Elena's instincts, built entirely from stitched wounds and careful notes, had been right. An organized threat was testing Blackthorn's borders, and it was larger and more disciplined than anyone had initially feared. Damien called for increased patrols immediately, doubling the guard along the eastern ridge, and ordering a full council to reconvene the following week to determine the next course of action. In the chaos of preparation that followed, he found himself standing beside Elena more often than either of them had anticipated, coordinating supply routes for the healer's den in case of casualties, discussing evacuation plans for pack members living closest to the threatened border. Their conversations remained strictly professional, but professional proximity, Damien was discovering, was its own kind of torment. Every time she leaned over the war table to point out a detail on the map, every time her voice carried across the room with calm authority, the ache in his chest twisted a little tighter, a constant reminder of exactly what he had rejected, and exactly how thoroughly she had moved forward without him. He caught himself, more than once, staring at her a beat too long, before forcing his attention back to the maps in front of him. He caught Marcus noticing these moments too, though his old friend was wise enough, for now, to say nothing about it. Elena, for her part, remained carefully guarded around him, keeping every interaction rooted firmly in strategy, and nothing else. If she felt the bond pulling at her during their long hours in the war room, she gave no outward sign of it, her focus locked entirely on the growing threat along the border, on the responsibility she had built for herself, on anything except the man whose rejection had once nearly broken her, and whose sickness now bound them together in ways neither of them had asked for. But even as she kept her guard firmly in place, she could not entirely ignore the way the pack had begun to look at the two of them together in that war room, an Alpha King and the healer he had once cast aside, working seamlessly toward a common purpose neither could accomplish alone. Whatever story the pack had told itself the night of the rejection ceremony was no longer the story being told now, and neither Damien nor Elena could yet say for certain how this new version would end. A horn sounded from the western gate before the sun had fully cleared the mountains, and within minutes, the entire pack grounds had shifted into the particular alertness reserved for outsiders. Word spread quickly that a delegation from the Ashford pack had arrived, led by their alpha, Kieran Ashford, a wolf whose territory bordered Blackthorn's western edge, and whose reputation for shrewd, sometimes ruthless negotiation preceded him by years. Damien met the delegation at the gate himself, flanked by Marcus and a handful of senior warriors, his posture perfectly composed despite the fatigue that still lived beneath his ribs most days. Kieran Ashford was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy, confident smile that made it difficult to tell whether he was being genuinely friendly or simply patient while he searched for weaknesses to exploit. He explained that his pack had also noticed increased rogue activity along the shared border between their territories, and he proposed a temporary alliance, a coordinated patrol system that would benefit both packs if the organized threat Elena had identified turned out to be as large as feared. It was, on the surface, a reasonable proposal, but Damien had heard enough about Kieran Ashford's history to know that alliances with him rarely stayed simple, and that any agreement signed too quickly tended to favor Ashford territory far more than it favored the pack foolish enough to trust him at face value. He invited the delegation to the Great Hall for a formal negotiation, buying himself time to think through the terms carefully. Elena was called into the negotiation on the second day, once again in her capacity as border strategy advisor, this time to present the evidence she had gathered about the coordinated attacks. She walked into the Great Hall with her notes organized and her expression carefully neutral, aware that every eye in the room, including Kieran Ashford's, would be assessing her the moment she began to speak. She did not disappoint. She laid out the wound patterns, the timing correlations, the formation evidence Owen's scouts had confirmed, presenting all of it with the same calm clarity she used with every patient who came through the healer's den. Kieran Ashford listened with visible interest, occasionally asking sharp, probing questions, clearly designed to test whether her conclusions would hold up under pressure. Elena answered every single one, without hesitation, never once flustered, never once giving him an opening to dismiss her analysis as guesswork. Partway through the negotiation, Kieran shifted the conversation in a direction no one in the room expected. He asked Elena, with a faint smile that suggested he already knew the answer, whether she was the same healer whose rejection ceremony had been the subject of considerable gossip among neighboring packs weeks earlier. The room went tense instantly. Marcus's hand tightened on the table. Damien's jaw locked so hard, a muscle visibly jumped along his cheek. Elena did not so much as blink. She told Kieran, with perfect composure, that she was, and that she failed to see how the matter was relevant to a discussion about coordinated border defense. Her tone was cool enough that even Kieran, a wolf not easily unsettled, seemed briefly caught off guard by how thoroughly she had refused to give him the reaction he had clearly been fishing for. He recovered quickly, offering a small, almost respectful nod, and remarked that a wolf with her composure would be a formidable asset to any pack, his or otherwise. It was meant, Damien understood immediately, as more than a compliment. It was a subtle probe, an opening bid disguised as flattery, testing whether the healer sitting across the table might be interested in an alliance of her own, separate from whatever loyalty she still held to Blackthorn. Elena thanked him for the compliment with polite indifference, and steered the conversation firmly back to the strategic matter at hand, refusing to acknowledge the deeper implication in his words. But Damien had heard it clearly, and the possessive flare of something sharp and unwelcome that rose in his chest at the thought of Elena aligning herself with another pack, another alpha, startled him with its intensity. He had rejected her. He had no claim left to defend, and yet the mere suggestion that she might belong somewhere other than Blackthorn made the ache beneath his ribs twist violently enough that he had to force his breathing steady beneath the table. The negotiation continued for another hour, ultimately resulting in a carefully worded agreement for coordinated patrols along the shared border, with terms that Damien, sharpened by his growing unease, managed to negotiate far more favorably than Kieran had likely anticipated. When the delegation finally departed the following morning, Marcus remarked quietly to Damien that the Ashford Alpha had left with considerably less than he had arrived hoping to secure, largely thanks to how well Elena's evidence had strengthened Blackthorn's position at the table. Damien agreed, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment Kieran had looked at Elena the way a wolf looks at something he intends to claim, and the memory of his own reaction to it. He found Elena later that day near the healer's den, sorting freshly gathered herbs into labeled jars, and he approached her before he had fully decided what he intended to say. She glanced up when his shadow fell across the doorway, her expression settling immediately into the same careful neutrality she used whenever they spoke outside official council business. He asked her, without quite meaning to, whether Kieran Ashford's offer had interested her. The question came out sharper than he intended, and he watched her eyebrows lift slightly at the tone. She set down the jar in her hands and told him plainly that his question was not his to ask. She reminded him, evenly, that he had made his choice regarding her the night of the rejection ceremony, and that whatever she chose to do with her future, whether that meant staying at Blackthorn or accepting an offer from another pack entirely, was no longer a matter that required his input or his permission. She said it without cruelty, but without softness either, the same steady honesty she had shown him since the night she walked out of that clearing. Damien stood in the doorway for a long moment after she finished speaking, absorbing the truth of what she had said. He had no right to feel possessive. He had no right to feel anything at all about who Elena chose to align herself with. And yet standing there, watching her return calmly to sorting her herbs as though the conversation had cost her nothing, he understood with painful clarity just how much of his own claim to her he had thrown away in that clearing, and how completely she had already learned to build a life that did not depend on getting it back. He left without another word, the ache beneath his ribs sharper than it had been in days, and somewhere behind him, though he could not see it, Elena's hands trembled slightly over the jars before she steadied them and continued her work. The Eastern Patrol never returned that night, and by the time a search party found their scent trail, it was already tangled with blood and the marks of a fight that had clearly not gone in Blackthorn's favor. 2 warriors were dead. A third, Owen, was found alive but badly wounded, dragged half-conscious through the underbrush by wolves who had risked their own safety to bring him back within the border. The organized threat Elena had identified weeks earlier was no longer testing Blackthorn's defenses. It had struck. The pack grounds erupted into controlled chaos as the wounded were carried toward the healer's den, and the war horn sounded a full alert across the territory. Elena was already waiting when they arrived, her instructions sharp and immediate, directing Priya and 2 trainees toward the less severe injuries while she took Owen herself, recognizing the young warrior whose forearm she had stitched weeks earlier, now bearing wounds far more serious than a training accident. She worked for hours without pause, her hands steady even as exhaustion crept into her shoulders, refusing to let herself think about anything beyond the injury directly in front of her. It was well past midnight before she finally stabilized him enough to step outside the den for air, her arms streaked with blood, her mind still racing through everything that needed to happen before dawn. She found Damien standing just outside the door, having clearly been waiting, though whether he had been there minutes or hours she could not tell. His face was drawn tight with the particular grief of an alpha who had just lost warriors under his command, a weight she recognized from her own father's stories about the burden of leadership. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavier than any words could have been. It was Damien who broke it first, asking quietly whether Owen would survive. Elena told him honestly that the next few hours would decide it, that she had done everything within her skill, and that the rest was now a matter of how strong Owen's own body proved to be. Damien nodded slowly, his jaw tight, and for a moment, Elena saw something in his eyes that looked less like the composed Alpha King the pack had grown used to, and more like a young man who had inherited a crown far too soon and was only now beginning to feel the true weight of every life it made him responsible for. She should have gone back inside immediately. Instead, she found herself lingering, watching him absorb the grief of the night in silence, and for the first time since the rejection ceremony, something in her chest softened toward him. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that the man in front of her was carrying more than pride and cold decisions. He was carrying fear too, the same kind of fear that had driven him to reject her in the first place, and watching it now, stripped of any performance for the pack's benefit, she understood it a little more clearly than she had allowed herself to before. The moment did not last. A warrior arrived at a run, breathless, reporting that scouts had spotted the retreating attackers regrouping near the northern ridge, and Damien's expression hardened instantly back into the composed alpha the pack needed him to be. He thanked Elena for her work, his voice formal again, and turned to follow the warrior back toward the war room, leaving her standing alone in the cold night air, with a strange ache in her chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Over the following days, the pack mobilized fully in response to the attack, warriors rotating through border patrols in far greater numbers. The healer's den converted temporarily into something closer to a field hospital as injuries continued to trickle in from skirmishes along the ridge. Damien pushed himself relentlessly through it all, leading patrols personally, coordinating strategy late into every night, refusing to rest, even as the strain visibly wore him down. Marcus watched his alpha's health deteriorate with growing alarm, noting the way Damien's hands shook slightly during council meetings, the way his usually sharp focus began slipping more frequently, the way color drained from his face after even moderate exertion. He knew, with a certainty that frightened him, that the rejection sickness was compounding with genuine physical exhaustion in a way that could not continue much longer without serious consequence. He raised the concern privately more than once, and each time Damien brushed it aside, insisting the pack's safety came first, that his own well-being was a problem for later. The breaking point came during a strategy session 6 days after the attack, when Damien stood to address the assembled warriors about the following morning's planned counter-patrol. Midway through his sentence, his vision blurred violently, the room tilting beneath him without warning. He gripped the edge of the war table hard enough to make his knuckles white, fighting to stay upright, and for a moment, it seemed he might succeed. Then his knees gave out entirely, and he collapsed in front of the full assembled council, his body convulsing slightly as his wolf, starved for the bond it had been denied for weeks, surged violently against his control. The room erupted into panic. Warriors who had never seen their alpha show weakness of any kind stared in open shock as Marcus dropped to his knees beside him, shouting for the healer's den. Elena arrived within minutes, her training overriding the fear that spiked through her at the sight of Damien's body shaking uncontrollably on the war room floor, his eyes glazed and unfocused, his wolf clearly straining against the edges of his human control, in a way she had never witnessed in anyone. She knelt beside him, her hands pressed firmly against his chest, feeling his heartbeat racing erratically beneath her palms, and in that moment, the bond flared to life inside her, with an intensity she could no longer suppress, a warmth that seemed to pour instinctively from her hands into his shaking body. Whether it was her training, her presence, or the faint thread of the bond responding despite everything, Damien's convulsions slowly began to ease, his breathing steadying beneath her touch until his eyes finally focused, finding hers with a raw, unguarded vulnerability that startled her more than his collapse had. The room around them had gone utterly silent, every warrior and elder present watching the scene unfold, with a mixture of fear and dawning understanding. This was no longer a private matter that Marcus could quietly manage behind closed doors. The entire pack had just witnessed their Alpha King brought to his knees, and every single one of them now understood, without needing to be told, exactly why. By morning, there was no version of the story left untold. Every wolf in Blackthorn territory knew that their Alpha King had collapsed in front of the full council, that the woman he had publicly rejected weeks earlier had been the one to steady him, and that the two events were, according to whispers now spoken openly rather than behind closed hands, directly connected. The silence that had followed Elena out of the rejection ceremony had returned, but this time it followed Damien, heavy with a question the pack no longer bothered to hide, whether their alpha's pride had cost him something none of them had realized was possible to lose. Damien spent 2 days confined to his quarters under Priya's supervision, while Elena split her time between his care and the ongoing flood of border injuries still arriving at the healer's den. She treated him with the same clinical detachment she gave every patient, checking his pulse, monitoring his fever, adjusting the herbal remedies she prepared to ease the worst of the sickness's symptoms, and offering nothing beyond what his body required. She did not speak to him beyond what was medically necessary. She did not linger. Every visit was brief, efficient, and utterly professional, and Damien, lying weak and humiliated in his own bed, found the distance more painful than the sickness itself. On the 3rd day, once he was strong enough to sit upright without assistance, he asked Priya to leave them alone. Elena hesitated at the request, clearly reluctant, but ultimately allowed it, perhaps recognizing that some conversations could not be postponed indefinitely. Once the door closed behind Priya, Damien looked at Elena for a long moment, gathering the words he had been turning over since the moment he regained consciousness on the war room floor. He told her, plainly, and without the guarded pride that had defined every previous interaction between them, that he had been wrong. He said the rejection had been a mistake born from fear rather than strength, that he had convinced himself vulnerability would weaken him as an alpha, only to discover that trying to erase the bond had weakened him far more thoroughly than accepting it ever could have. He told her he understood now what Marcus had been trying to tell him for weeks, that the sickness would not stop, that his own body would continue punishing him until the bond was restored, and he asked her, with a rawness the pack had never seen from him, whether she would consider renewing it. Elena listened to all of it without interrupting, her expression giving away nothing until he finished speaking. When she finally responded, her voice was calm, but there was an edge of steel beneath it that made clear this was not a decision she intended to make lightly or quickly. She told him that she understood his sickness was real, that she had seen the evidence of it herself, kneeling beside him on that war room floor, and that she did not doubt his suffering was genuine. But she told him, just as plainly, that his suffering was not, by itself, a reason for her to renew a bond he had thrown away in front of the entire pack. She reminded him that respect was not something a person could reclaim, simply by admitting a mistake, once the consequences became unbearable. She said that if she agreed to restore the bond now, in this moment, it would be because his body demanded it, and not because he had actually changed, and she refused to spend the rest of her life as a cure, administered out of necessity, rather than a mate chosen out of genuine want. She told him that she needed more than an apology delivered from a sickbed. She needed proof, sustained over time, that the man asking for her now was different from the one who had rejected her in that clearing, and that proof could not be rushed simply because his condition made him desperate. Damien absorbed her words in silence, and though disappointment flickered across his face, it was tempered by something that looked almost like respect. He told her, quietly, that he understood, and that he would not ask her again until he had earned the right to. Elena studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign that his acceptance was merely strategic, another performance calculated to win her over through patience rather than genuine change. She found, to her own surprise, something that looked sincere. She left his quarters without further conversation, but the walk back to the healer's den felt different than it had in weeks. The ache of the bond in her chest tangled now with something new, a cautious, unwelcome flicker of hope she immediately tried to suppress. She reminded herself, firmly, of everything she had built in the weeks since the rejection, the respect she had earned, the purpose she had found, the strength she had proven she did not need Damien Cross to validate. She would not let one sickbed apology unravel any of it, no matter how genuine it had sounded. News of the refusal spread through the pack almost as quickly as news of the collapse had, and the reaction surprised everyone, including Elena herself. Rather than pity or criticism, the story that took shape this time carried something closer to admiration. Wolves spoke of her composure with genuine awe, marveling that she had looked her Alpha King in the eye while he lay weakened by sickness, and told him plainly that his desperation was not enough to buy back what his pride had cost him. Among the pack elders, quiet conversations began to shift in tone, no longer centered on sympathy for a jilted Omega, but on genuine respect for a woman who had refused to compromise her own worth, even when the most powerful wolf in the territory begged her to. Marcus found Elena that evening near the healer's den, and though he said little, the look he gave her carried a weight of gratitude she had not expected. He told her, carefully, that Damien needed to hear exactly what she had told him, that no one else in the pack, including Marcus himself, had ever had the courage to speak to their alpha with that kind of honesty. He said it might take time, but he believed, for the first time since the sickness began, that Damien finally understood the true cost of what he had done, and that understanding, however painful, was the only path that could lead to something real between them, if either of them chose to walk it. Elena thanked him quietly and returned to her work, but that night, lying awake in her small room above the healer's den, she allowed herself, just once, to wonder what it might look like if Damien truly changed, if the man begging for a second chance from his sickbed became someone worth trusting with her heart, rather than someone she needed to protect herself against. She fell asleep before she could answer the question, but it lingered in the back of her mind through the days that followed, quiet and persistent, refusing to be entirely dismissed. A group of elders gathered in the eastern meeting hall before sunrise, their voices low but urgent, discussing a subject none of them would have dared raise openly, just weeks earlier. Freya, the eldest among them and a wolf who had served 3 alphas across her long life, laid out the concern plainly to the others seated around the table. Their alpha king had collapsed in front of the full council. He had nearly lost control of his wolf entirely, an event unheard of among Blackthorn leadership in living memory, and the cause, now known to every wolf in the territory, was a wound entirely of his own making. Freya did not suggest, at least not yet, that Damien should be removed from leadership. But she raised a question that the others could not easily dismiss, whether a pack could truly trust an alpha whose judgment had led directly to his own physical collapse, and whether his continued instability posed a genuine risk to Blackthorn's safety during a period when an organized enemy was actively testing their borders. The conversation that followed was careful, measured, but unmistakably serious, the first quiet murmurs of what could eventually become a formal challenge to Damien's leadership. Word of the meeting reached Marcus within the day, carried to him by a younger elder who had grown uneasy with the direction the conversation had taken. Marcus brought the news to Damien immediately, watching his friend's face carefully as he relayed what had been discussed. Damien took the news with a grim, quiet acceptance that surprised Marcus more than outrage would have. He said only that he understood why the elders were concerned, and that he intended to prove them wrong through his actions rather than through argument. He threw himself back into his duties with renewed discipline, careful this time to balance his responsibilities with actual rest, following Elena's medical guidance even though she was no longer speaking to him beyond what strategy meetings required. He delegated more evenly among his warriors, instead of insisting on leading every patrol himself, a shift Marcus noted with quiet relief, recognizing it as the first sign that Damien had genuinely absorbed the lesson his collapse had forced upon him. Elena, meanwhile, found herself in an increasingly uncomfortable position as her own standing within the pack continued to rise, even as Damien's grew more precarious. Warriors and elders alike began seeking her counsel, not just on medical matters but on strategy more broadly, trusting her judgment in ways that occasionally left her uneasy, aware that her growing influence was being quietly compared, by some, to Damien's faltering leadership. She heard the comparisons whispered more than once, wolves suggesting, half seriously, that the pack might be better served by a healer with a clear head than an alpha whose own body had betrayed him. She rejected the comparisons firmly whenever she heard them, refusing to let herself become a symbol in a political struggle she had never asked to be part of. She reminded anyone who raised the subject that Damien remained a capable leader whose judgment on matters of strategy and defense had proven sound even through his personal difficulties, and that questioning his leadership over a private matter of the heart, however publicly it had unfolded, risked destabilizing the pack at precisely the moment unity mattered most. Her defense of him, delivered with the same calm conviction she brought to every conversation, surprised those who expected her to relish any weakening of the man who had wronged her. It surprised Damien too, when word of it eventually reached him through Marcus. He found her one evening near the training yard, watching a group of young pups practice basic defensive stances under Owen's patient instruction, the warrior having recovered well enough from his injuries to resume light duties. Damien approached slowly, careful not to startle her, and thanked her, quietly, for defending him to the elders when she had every reason not to. Elena told him plainly that her defense had nothing to do with him personally, and everything to do with the pack's stability, that a leadership challenge during an active border threat could cost lives far beyond anything his personal failings had already cost. She said it firmly enough that Damien understood not to mistake her honesty for renewed affection. He accepted the correction without argument, though something in his expression suggested he had hoped, if only briefly, for something warmer. He told her that regardless of her reasons, he was grateful, and that he intended to keep proving to the elders, and to her, that their trust was not misplaced. Elena studied him for a moment before responding, noting the steadiness in his voice, the absence of the desperation that had colored his sickbed apology weeks earlier. She told him, carefully, that proving it would take more than a single conversation, and that she intended to keep watching before she allowed herself to believe anything had truly changed. It was, though neither of them named it directly, the closest thing to encouragement she had offered him since the rejection ceremony, and Damien carried the small exchange with him through the following days like something fragile he was afraid to examine too closely, for fear it would slip away. The elders' concerns did not disappear entirely, but they softened somewhat over the following weeks, as Damien's leadership stabilized, his health steadier under Elena's continued medical guidance, his decisions sharper now that he had learned, however painfully, the cost of pushing himself past his limits. Freya remained watchful, unwilling to fully set aside her doubts until she saw sustained proof rather than a temporary improvement, but even she acknowledged, in a private conversation with Marcus, that the Alpha King seemed genuinely different than the wolf who had rejected his mate in that clearing months earlier. Beneath the surface of pack politics and border strategy, something quieter had begun shifting between Damien and Elena as well, a fragile, cautious thaw neither of them fully trusted yet, built not on desperation or sickness, but on the slow accumulation of small moments, a defended reputation here, an honest conversation there, proof offered in pieces too small to declare victory over, but too consistent to entirely dismiss. Whether it would be enough to survive whatever still lay ahead for Blackthorn Pack remained, for now, an open question that both of them carried silently, unwilling to voice it aloud until they were certain of the answer. Smoke rose from the northern watchtower, before the alarm horn had even finished its first call, visible from nearly every corner of Blackthorn territory. A scout came sprinting into the pack grounds moments later, breathless, reporting that the organized enemy force had struck the outer watchpost directly, overwhelming the small garrison stationed there, before retreating into the forest as quickly as they had come. 2 watchmen were dead. The tower itself was badly damaged, its signal fire deliberately extinguished in what could only be read as a calculated message, proof that this enemy could strike Blackthorn's defenses whenever it chose. Damien assembled the War Council within the hour, and this time, there was no hesitation in requesting Elena's presence, no lingering pretense that her involvement was merely tactical convenience. She arrived already prepared, her notes updated with every skirmish pattern gathered over the past weeks, and together with Owen's scouting reports, the picture that emerged was more alarming than anyone had anticipated. The enemy force was not simply testing Blackthorn's borders anymore. It was probing for the precise location of weaknesses, ahead of what appeared to be a larger, coordinated assault. The council worked through the night, Damien directing strategy with a clarity and steadiness that impressed even Freya, seated near the back of the room with her arms crossed, watching her Alpha King closely for any sign of the instability that had worried her weeks earlier. She found none. Damien listened carefully to every voice at the table, weighed Elena's medical assessments alongside Owen's tactical reports, and made decisions with a measured confidence that bore little resemblance to the wolf who had once insisted on shouldering every burden alone. It was during a brief pause in the planning, warriors dispersing temporarily to relay orders while the core council regrouped, that Damien and Elena found themselves alone at the edge of the war table, both studying the same map in silence. He asked her, quietly, whether she was afraid, given how close the fighting had come to pack grounds for the first time. Elena considered the question honestly before answering, admitting that she was, but that fear had never stopped her from doing what needed to be done, not during the rejection, not during his sickness, and not now. Damien looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded passing across his face before he could stop it. He told her, quietly, that watching her work through every crisis the pack had faced over the past weeks, without ever once losing her composure or her purpose, had taught him more about real strength than anything his father had ever tried to teach him, about ruling without vulnerability. He said he understood now that his father's lessons had been incomplete, that strength without connection was not strength at all, merely isolation dressed up in armor. Elena listened without responding immediately, the weight of his words settling somewhere she had spent weeks trying to guard against. Before she could decide how to answer, Marcus returned with fresh reports, and the moment dissolved back into the urgency of preparing Blackthorn's defenses. But something had shifted in that brief exchange. A crack in the careful distance Elena had maintained since his sickbed apology, small enough that neither of them acknowledged it directly, but real enough that both of them carried it with them through the tense days that followed. Over the next week, Blackthorn's warriors worked around the clock reinforcing the border, repairing the damaged watchtower, and preparing contingency plans for the healer's den, in case the feared larger assault materialized. Elena organized supply stores with ruthless efficiency, training additional pack members in basic wound care to ensure the den could handle mass casualties if it came to that. Damien split his time between strategy sessions and hands-on patrol reinforcement, careful now to pace himself, to delegate when his body signaled it needed rest, applying the hard lesson his collapse had taught him, with a discipline that did not go unnoticed by the elders still quietly watching his every move. Freya approached Elena privately during this period, finding her alone in the healer's den late one evening, sorting freshly prepared bandages into organized stacks. The elder studied her for a long moment before speaking, her tone carrying none of the skepticism it once had toward the young healer who had risen so unexpectedly to prominence. She told Elena, plainly, that she had watched the pack's fortunes shift considerably since the night of the rejection ceremony, and that whatever the outcome between Elena and their alpha turned out to be, the pack owed her a debt it could not easily repay. She said it was rare, in her long life, to watch someone build genuine respect from the wreckage of public humiliation, and rarer still, to watch that same person extend grace to the very man responsible for it, simply because the pack's well-being demanded nothing less. Elena thanked her quietly, uncertain how to respond to praise so directly given, and Freya left without further comment, though the conversation lingered with Elena long after the elder had gone. She found herself, in the quiet hours that followed, allowing herself to consider more openly what she had spent weeks refusing to examine too closely, whether the changes she had witnessed in Damien, the discipline, the humility, the willingness to listen rather than command, represented something real enough to eventually risk her heart on again. She had no answer yet, but for the first time since the clearing where he had rejected her in front of the entire pack, she found herself willing to keep watching for one, rather than closing the door on the possibility entirely. Whatever tested Blackthorn in the days ahead, it was becoming clear that Elena and Damien would face it standing closer together than either of them had expected to stand again, bound not only by a fading sickness and an unbroken bond, but by something neither of them had fully named, growing quietly stronger with every crisis they weathered side by side. The full moon rose heavy and silver over Blackthorn territory on the night the entire pack gathered for the moon gathering, a ceremony held once each season to honor the wolves lost in service to the pack and to renew the bonds that held the community together. Given the recent losses along the border, this year's gathering carried a weight of grief and tension that no ceremony in recent memory had matched. Every warrior and elder present, acutely aware that the enemy threatening their lands remained out there, watching, waiting for its moment. Damien stood at the center of the stone circle, as tradition demanded, preparing to speak the names of the fallen, his voice steady, despite the exhaustion that still lingered beneath his composure. Elena stood among the healers, near the front of the gathered crowd, her eyes occasionally drifting toward him, despite her best efforts to keep her focus on the ceremony itself. Neither of them could have predicted what was about to happen. Partway through the recitation of names, Damien's voice faltered. It was subtle at first, a slight catch in his breathing that only Marcus, standing closest to him, noticed immediately. Then his hands began to tremble, the ache beneath his ribs flaring with an intensity far beyond anything he had experienced before, the full moon's power interacting violently with the rejection sickness that had never fully released its grip on him despite weeks of careful management. His wolf surged against his control with a force that caught him entirely off guard, the animal instinct within him, sensing the moon's pull, and the unresolved bond, simultaneously, overwhelming the careful discipline he had spent weeks rebuilding. His eyes flashed amber, then back to their normal color, then amber again, a visible sign to everyone present that their Alpha King was losing his grip on the transformation entirely outside of his own will. Panic rippled through the gathered crowd as warriors instinctively stepped back, creating distance around a wolf whose control was clearly failing, in a way none of them had ever witnessed from an alpha during a public ceremony. Marcus moved to intervene, but Damien's arm shot out, warning him back, his voice a guttural growl that barely resembled his own, as he fought against the transformation threatening to consume him entirely in front of his own pack. Elena did not step back. Where every other wolf in the circle instinctively retreated from the danger, she pushed forward, ignoring Priya's alarmed grip on her arm, ignoring the collective gasp that rose from the crowd as she crossed the open space toward an Alpha King, on the verge of losing himself completely. She reached him just as his knees buckled, his body caught between the shape of a man and the shape of a wolf, neither form fully realized, his control shattering under the combined weight of the moon and months of denied bond. She placed both hands against his chest, exactly as she had during his collapse in the war room weeks earlier. But this time, she did not simply monitor his pulse or check his breathing. She let the bond flare fully open between them, deliberately, for the first time since the rejection ceremony, pouring every ounce of the connection she had spent weeks guarding so carefully into the space between them. Warmth radiated from her hands into his shaking body, and slowly, visibly, the amber flashing in his eyes steadied, his transformation halting somewhere between the two shapes, held in place by the sheer force of the bond finally being allowed to breathe. The entire pack watched in stunned silence as their Alpha King, moments from losing control entirely in front of everyone he was sworn to protect, gradually steadied beneath the healer's touch, his breathing slowing, his eyes returning fully to their natural color, his body settling back into its human form, with visible relief. When he finally looked up at Elena, kneeling in front of him with her hands still pressed against his chest, the raw vulnerability in his expression was something the pack had never witnessed from him before, not during his collapse, not during his sickness, nothing that compared to the naked honesty on his face in that moment. He spoke then, his voice carrying clearly across the silent circle despite its roughness, addressing not just Elena, but the entire gathered pack. He told them that the sickness threatening to consume him was not some mysterious illness, as many had assumed, but the direct consequence of his own rejection of his fated mate, a decision born from fear rather than wisdom, a mistake he had spent every day since trying and failing to fully undo. He told them that watching Elena build a life of purpose and respect entirely separate from him had taught him something his pride had refused to accept in that clearing months earlier, that true strength was never about isolation, that an alpha who could not admit his own vulnerability was not protecting his pack but endangering it, exactly as his near loss of control had just proven in front of every single one of them. He looked at Elena directly then, his voice dropping lower, though it still carried through the silent circle. He told her that he understood if she never chose to forgive him, that he had no right to expect it after everything he had put her through, but that he needed her to know. In front of the pack that had witnessed his worst moment, that rejecting her had been the single greatest failure of his life, and that whatever came next, whether she chose to walk away from him permanently or not, he would spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of the bond he had so foolishly thrown away. The clearing remained silent for a long moment after he finished speaking, hundreds of wolves holding their breath, waiting to see how Elena would respond to a confession so raw and public that it left no room for either of them to hide behind pride any longer. Elena looked at him for a long time, her hands still resting against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her palms for the first time since his sickness began. She did not answer him immediately. Instead, she rose slowly to her feet, extending a hand to help him rise as well, a small gesture that carried more weight in that silent circle than any words could have. The pack watched, breathless, as their Alpha King accepted her hand and stood, the two of them facing each other in the center of the stone circle, exactly where, months earlier, he had rejected her in front of everyone. The silence that had followed her out of that clearing had finally, fully, returned to witness whatever she chose to say next. Elena stood facing Damien in the center of the stone circle, the entire pack holding its breath around them, and for the first time since the night he had rejected her in this exact spot, she allowed herself to speak without weighing every word for armor. She told him that she had spent months building a version of herself that did not need him, a life measured in respect earned through her own hands, rather than a title given by his bond, and that she was proud, fiercely proud, of every piece of that life she had built from nothing but her own resolve. She told him that she had watched him change, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small ones, a defended reputation, an honest conversation, a willingness to delegate rather than shoulder every burden alone, a public confession that cost him more pride than most alphas would ever willingly surrender. She said she had noticed all of it, even when she refused to admit it to herself, and that the man standing in front of her now, humbled and honest in front of his entire pack, was someone genuinely different from the wolf who had cast her aside out of fear. But she told him, just as clearly, that gratitude for his growth and forgiveness for his mistake were not the same thing as surrendering everything she had built to become his mate again, simply because the moment demanded a satisfying answer. She said that if she accepted the bond now, it would not be as the frightened Omega he had rejected in this clearing, desperate for his approval, but as an equal, a woman with her own standing in this pack, her own voice in its councils, her own right to walk away again if he ever let fear make his choices for him a second time. Damien listened to every word without interrupting, and when she finished, he nodded slowly, telling her that he would not have it any other way, that an alpha king who wanted a mate who simply agreed with him had learned nothing at all from the months he had just survived. He told her that he did not want the version of her that would have accepted him back the night of his sickbed apology, desperate and grateful for scraps of attention. He wanted the version of her standing in front of him now, unafraid to demand exactly what she deserved, because that was the version of her his wolf had recognized as a true mate from the very beginning, long before either of them understood what that recognition would cost them both to honor properly. Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for any trace of the fear that had driven his rejection in the first place, and found instead something steady, something that had clearly been tempered by months of consequence, into a strength that no longer needed to prove itself through isolation. She told him, finally, that she accepted the bond, not as an act of mercy or obligation, but as a genuine choice, made with clear eyes, and a heart that had survived his rejection strong enough to know exactly what it wanted now. The clearing erupted into sound the moment the words left her lips, hundreds of wolves who had watched this story unfold from its lowest point, releasing a collective breath of relief and celebration that echoed off the surrounding mountains. Marcus, standing near the edge of the circle, allowed himself a rare, unguarded smile, watching his oldest friend finally claim the mate he had once been too afraid to accept. Freya, watching from among the elders, nodded slowly to herself, satisfied that the pack's future finally rested in hands worthy of carrying it. Priya made her way through the celebrating crowd to reach Elena's side, embracing her tightly, whispering that she had never doubted for a moment that her friend would find her way to exactly this outcome, on her own terms and no one else's. Owen, still recovering from his injuries but present for the ceremony regardless, called out congratulations from where he stood among the other warriors, and the young pups who had once whispered about the healer's daughter with pity, now cheered for her with open admiration, watching a story reshape itself in real time, from tragedy into triumph. In the weeks that followed, Elena did not step back from the role she had built for herself within the pack. She continued running the healer's den with the same discipline and skill that had earned her the pack's respect long before Damien's confession restored their bond, and she remained a permanent voice on the Border Strategy Council, her insight proving invaluable as Blackthorn continued strengthening its defenses against the organized threat still lurking beyond its borders. Damien, for his part, made good on his promise, consulting her genuinely on matters of leadership rather than simply expecting her presence beside him, building a partnership between them that bore little resemblance to the isolated rule he had once believed necessary for strength. The pack that had gone silent the night of the rejection ceremony found its voice again slowly, then all at once, the story of their Alpha King and his healer, becoming something told not with pity or scandal, but with genuine pride, a reminder passed down through the territory that even the deepest mistakes could be undone, through humility, patience, and the courage to become someone worth trusting again. Elena Voss had accepted a rejection that should have broken her, and in refusing to let it, She had built something far stronger than the bond Damien once threw away, a version of herself, and eventually, a version of them both, that neither pride, nor sickness, nor fear could ever again tear apart.